Good evening. Thanks for that warm welcome, and thank you, Skip, for that most generous introduction. I'm delighted to be back in Little Rock and with you all here at the Clinton School of Public Service. It's a real honor to be invited to speak at this prestigious institution, especially, as Skip mentioned, on the anniversary of September the 11th. For all that, I owe Skip another round of thanks. I also am grateful that he obliged and was kind enough to slide this a little later in the day so I could, as he mentioned, attend the dedication of the Pentagon Memorial this morning. As you no doubt remember, 184 people were killed when al-Qaeda hijacked American Airlines Flight 77 and crashed it into the south side of the Pentagon. 7 years later, there now stands a stunningly simple and yet really elegant memorial at the crash site. A very moving tribute to the victims of that attack and a permanent reminder of the terrible sacrifice they made that day. Although I must tell you that they and all the souls lost on September the 11th are always on the minds of those of us who work within the Pentagon. I urge each of you, as an aside, to, when you're next in Washington, really make a point of going over to the Pentagon and checking this out for yourself. It's open 24/7, 365, and it's well worth the effort. So make a point of doing that next time. I must tell you, I was a bit surprised when Skip called and asked me to come down and talk with you all, not because I worked for President Bush, but because he knew me 16 years ago when I was breaking into journalism as a cub reporter at KATV, and he has all the embarrassing stories from my rookie reporting days to prove it. Given that there still exists a vast videotape library over there at 4th and Main, full of my on-air gaffes, I am certainly grateful that he didn't make this introduction tonight an audio-visual presentation. So thanks for sparing me and sparing you that. Luckily, you'll have to take me at my word that when I got here, as a 23-year-old, I was very, very green. I'll tell you one example, one story of that. My first breaking news live shot took place, sadly, at a fatal factory shooting, I believe, Jim, down in Pine Bluff, and I raced down there with a veteran cameraman who was totally nonchalant about the whole thing and totally leery of my abilities as a new reporter. But undeterred, I sprang out of the van and jumped in front of the camera. Trembling with excitement and nervousness, all my schooling suddenly failed me, and as if I were writing dialogue for a Batman comic book, I breathlessly described the gunman's rampage, finally being stopped when a factory worker, quote, clobbered him over the head with a lead pipe. I then foolishly declared that one of the shooting victims had been released from the hospital on his own recognizance, as if he were being set free from jail. It was a total disaster and must have made legendary KATV news director Jim Pitcock question his decision to hire me. Channel 7 was then the dominant station in this market, and Pitcock, who otherwise had a real knack for discovering talent, took a huge roll of the dice when he gave a job to this 23-year-old kid from Washington, D.C. I had grown up next door to Peter Jennings and very much looked up to him, dreaming one day of becoming a network correspondent myself. Years later, I worked at ABC News as a desk assistant, the TV equivalent of a copy boy. I mean, you make Xeroxes, you answer phones, but that's about it. And I held that position in college at Georgetown University, and then later as a graduate student at Columbia University. But by the time I came here, I had had zero on-air reporting experience. And nor had I been really to the South. And let me tell you, both showed. For example, I arrived for one of my first stories at the state fairgrounds. And get this, I was not wearing Wrangler jeans or boots, but a Brooks Brothers business suit and tassel loafers, looking much like I do now. Suffice it to say, I was a bit overdressed among the 4-H'ers and their livestock, and my Mike Wallace-inspired accusatory questioning style didn't go over very well either with the fairgoers. Some might think a market this size would be the perfect place for a young, aspiring newsman to go make some mistakes, learn from them, and without too much scrutiny. But in 1992, of course, Little Rock was the center of the political universe, and all the powers that be in network television news were watching everything that happened here very closely. Luckily, under Pitcock's tutelage, I quickly improved, learning a great deal both on and off camera. I toned down the wardrobe, dropped a bit of the Yankee edge, and soon realized the world does not revolve around Washington, D.C. I also happily discovered barbecue sandwiches are best topped with coleslaw, catfish with mustard and hot sauce. Sitting shivering in a flooded Stuttgart rice field can actually be a lot of fun when you down a banded duck on your first shot, as somehow I did. Pontoon boats are perfect for floating cocktail parties in hot springs, and there's nothing quite like an SEC football game. It was after one such game that I learned perhaps my most valuable lesson from Jim. It was about integrity. I bought my first car when I moved to Little Rock. City kid, I never had one until I was 23. I bought a 1971 Cadillac Eldorado convertible, and I was so excited to use it to tailgate at a Razorback game. However, the night before a big game, I got pulled over for speeding, and I did not have my proof of insurance handy. Well, the legislature had recently passed a law mandating that no insurance, cars impounded, no questions. So there went my big plans for a tailgate, or so I thought. I remembered that I had recently met a judge who might be in a position to help me recover my car in time. I called him at home late that Friday night, and he told me no problem, just go down to the impound lot, show my insurance, pay the fine, and pick up the caddy. I did exactly as instructed, then went to the game the next day and had a ball. I showed up for work Monday morning, raving to coworkers about my weekend exploits. Pitcock laughed along with the others, and then quietly called me into his office. Told me he was glad I had enjoyed myself and hoped it was worth it to me, because I would never be able to cover that judge again. By asking for that favor, Pitcock explained, I had compromised my credibility. He was, of course, absolutely right, and I felt absolutely terrible, especially because that judge would become very newsworthy when the Clintons' Whitewater scandal broke. His name, David Hale. Armed with that and other valuable lessons I learned in Little Rock, I spent the next 5 years working my way up to bigger and bigger local news markets until I was hired back at ABC News, only this time as a correspondent myself. My childhood dream was finally realized. I was based in the Chicago bureau, but traveled the world covering everything from 9/11 to the war with Iraq. Within a couple of years, ABC moved me back home to Washington, D.C., and assigned me to cover the White House, albeit primarily for the weekend broadcast. But I couldn't care less. I was reporting from the north lawn of the White House and flying around the world on Air Force One. As heady as that experience was, it soon became apparent to me that network news had changed a lot since I first worked there. Ratings were down, budgets were tight, travel, except on the White House beat, was limited, editorial decisions were at times suspect, and as a result of all this, the morale was low. Now, I reject the conventional wisdom that the networks have a liberal bias, but I do believe they have a geographic bias. All the powers that be live and work in New York, and thus see the world through the prism of their experiences in that big city. For example, it was a recurring frustration to ABC News correspondents, and I think this way at other networks as well, that stories they pitched to producers often would not get green-lighted until they showed up first in the New York Times. And then, of course, you had to scramble to catch up with the paper. I happen to think the broadcasts would be much more reflective of how most Americans live, and therefore much more popular programs, if more stories originated outside of Washington and New York and were done in places, frankly, like Little Rock. Of course, they weren't asking for my advice, and by the spring of 2007, after 7 years at ABC News, I was getting a little antsy. Full disclosure, my contract was also coming to an end. While my agent was looking for other television opportunities, I made it clear to him, as well as friends and colleagues, that I was open to pursuing new challenges, including perhaps even government service. Not long after putting that word out, White House counselor Dan Bartlett asked if I would be interested in becoming Pentagon press secretary. Now, to many of my former colleagues, that would be like joining the dark side, but I jumped at the opportunity. Truth is, every journalist is by nature fascinated by what it must be like on the inside of the room where decisions are made. And I was given a chance not just to hang out in that room, but to have a seat at the table and not just any table at any time. This was the Pentagon fighting 2 wars simultaneously, and I was to be the military's chief spokesman. It would certainly be a new challenge. It would certainly be the new challenge I had been seeking, but it would also be fraught with risk. The president was unpopular, the Iraq war was in real trouble back then, and Congress was threatening to pull the plug on all of it. But for the first time in a long time, there was also reason for hope. 30,000 additional troops were flowing into Baghdad and Anbar. As part of the surge, General David Petraeus had just begun to implement his much-anticipated COIN, or counterinsurgency strategy, and Robert Gates was the new Secretary of Defense. Dr. Gates was ideally suited for the job, especially at this perilous time. He had served 6 presidents over 3 decades in government before retiring in 1993 as CIA director and moving west. He was president of Texas A&M when in October of 2006, President Bush asked if he would return to Washington to once again serve his nation. An old-fashioned patriot, Gates could not possibly say no. Regardless of how we got into this war, Gates believed we simply could not afford to lose it. The consequences would be catastrophic for the United States, not to mention Iraq and the broader Middle East. So the low-key, straight-talking wise man took the helm at the Pentagon and immediately set out to turn the Iraq war from a front-burner crisis into a much more manageable, long-term foreign policy issue. That all made enormous sense to me, and I had planned to tell him so during my interview, but I never got the chance. In his candid, no-nonsense style, Gates hardly asked any questions of me, choosing instead to relay a few requirements of the job as he saw it. First of all, he wanted me to be as helpful as possible to the press. After all, the American people deserve to know as much as possible about what we were doing to help keep them safe. Second, he did not want a pit bull at the podium. Third, I don't know is a perfectly acceptable answer. Fourth, don't be a yes man. Tell it to me like it is. And fifth, recognizing that access to him was the key to my credibility with the press, the Secretary wanted me with him as much as possible, including all travel. No small requirement, considering that in less than 18 months we have visited more than 30 nations together, including 4 trips to Iraq, and we've flown more than 250,000 miles. Easier done, of course, when you're aboard a military 747, which is capable of being refueled in midair. Although that was still hard to explain to my wife, who I was leaving home with 2 young twin daughters. When the story broke that Gates had hired me, the blogs had a field day. The left-wing Huffington Post ran a piece by a former colleague at ABC News who claims that I had been a not-so-closeted conservative while I was covering the White House, while the right-wing media watchdog group Newsbusters said Geoff Morrell is no Tony Snow, a reference, of course, to the late White House press secretary. But a few gave me credit for being willing to serve my country, which is, after all, largely why I took the job. Like most Americans, since 9/11, I have felt a strong call to service. And with so many families sacrificing so much to protect me and my family, I wanted to do my part, however small. Of course, the fact that as Deputy Assistant Press Secretary, let me get this straight, I don't even know my own title. As Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense, I was the equivalent of a 3-star general. That didn't hurt either. As soon as I started the job, I was overwhelmed. I had covered stories at the Pentagon before, but realized I really didn't know a whole lot about the military. I mean, what's the difference between FMS and FCS? And how do you distinguish an RG-31 from a DDG-51? And why are all these people always talking in acronyms? I can't understand a thing they're saying, but I was determined to crack the code. I devoured briefing books, sat through endless PowerPoint presentations, and talked to anyone and everyone, no matter what rank, who was willing to tutor me on their particular specialty. With all due respect to Mrs. Clinton, it took far more than a village to get me up to speed. It required nearly all the resources of the Department of Defense and all their patience as well. But I didn't think I was ready to make my debut at the podium until I first went to Iraq. I mean, how could you credibly talk about the war until you go there and see it for yourself? Luckily, General David Petraeus agreed that would be helpful for all concerned, and his staff devised an ambitious agenda for my week-long visit. I flew all over the country on Blackhawks, dining with tribal sheikhs in Anbar, sharing tea with residents of Baghdad's Dura neighborhood, visiting special operators at work in Balad, checking out the huge detention facility in Buqa near Basra, and meeting with much of the Iraqi civilian and military leadership, including a most memorable helicopter ride with Prime Minister Maliki. It was an incredibly exciting, eye-opening experience, and I left Iraq fired up to get to the podium and share all the signs of progress that I had witnessed firsthand. Still, as I walked into the briefing room for the first time, I must have looked a bit nervous because a colleague stopped me and said, "Geoff, relax. You know way more now than you possibly would need to." He turned out to be right. I got to the podium and amazingly felt completely at home. And I guess it must have looked that way to others as well. Coworkers told me afterwards they were pleased to finally have someone out there relaying their story to the American people and through the press. And the press appreciated that they now had someone on the job who understood their needs. I felt as if I had finally found my true calling. Of course, not every briefing subsequent to that one has gone as swimmingly. After one in particular, MSNBC host Keith Olbermann offered a critique of my performance, although this was by no means constructive criticism. No, in fact, he concluded his on-air rant about something silly I had said at that day's briefing by exclaiming, "And you, Mr. Morrell, you are a moron." Frankly, it didn't bother me. He was right. Not about being a moron. But the answer I had given that day was insensitive and incomplete. Frankly, I knew too little about the issue in question, which related to several soldiers who had become ill from contaminated water in Iraq, to authoritatively answer it. This was one of those times when I should have heeded the Secretary's advice to me during our interview and just said, "I don't know, I'll get back to you." After another briefing, I was sure I had said something which at best would disappoint the Secretary, or at worst would set back our efforts to work with Russia on missile defense. A reporter had asked me about Russia's plans to reinstitute their old May Day parades through Red Square, the latest in a recent series of provocative moves by the Kremlin. As a kid, my dad had admonished me that if it feels good, don't say it. But I couldn't resist. Full of bravado, I quickly shot back that if the Russians want to dust off their old equipment and take it for a spin, that's their business. We couldn't care less. I could see the smiles of the press corps, and by the smiles of the press corps and the fact they were furiously scribbling down my quote that I had just made news. I went right up to see the Secretary, figuring it was better he heard it from me than read it in the paper in the morning. But to my astonishment, when I recounted the story, he started dying laughing, and immediately repeated the story to a room full of the Pentagon's most senior leaders. I got lucky that time. Had he been asked the same question, the Secretary almost certainly would not have answered it that way. But in this case, perhaps because of his own colorful history with the Russians, he didn't mind at all that I had. However, generally, the best spokespeople are the ones who can subjugate their own personality and instead adopt that of the guy or gal they represent. It requires sort of a mind meld. The job is really a series of balancing acts, not just between my natural instincts and those of the Secretary, but also between what you can say and what you can't. You see, I consume loads of information every day, much of it highly classified, so I must be constantly on guard that I don't share anything I shouldn't. I have good incentive not to. It's illegal and I could be thrown in jail. But it is still very tough to keep straight in your head what is secret and what is not, especially when you're getting grilled at the podium and know you have the perfect retort, but it's top secret. So sometimes, in fact oftentimes, you just have to grin and bear it. Politics is another walk on the tightrope. As a rule, the Defense Department tries to stay out of that arena as much as possible, but sometimes we just get sucked into it, especially when presidential candidates wish to visit military facilities. You may recall Senator Obama's ill-fated attempt to visit the wounded warriors at our military hospital in Landstuhl, Germany. Despite what you may have heard, he was more than welcome to do so. provided he went in his official capacity as a United States Senator and not as a presidential candidate. Nor could he be accompanied by campaign staff or press. Unfortunately, under those conditions, he chose not to attend. Those restrictions may seem a bit draconian to some, but we believe they are absolutely essential to maintaining the public's trust in the military. And needless to say, they are enforced equally across the political spectrum. In fact, Alaska Governor Sarah Palin is bidding farewell to her son and other deploying troops at Fort Wainwright, Alaska today. But because she is also a vice presidential candidate, she is not allowed to make any political comments or have any interaction with the press while on base. Since day one on the job, I have taken copious notes. Don't worry, I have no intention of pulling a Scott McClellan. But every day in the Pentagon is a whirlwind, and notes help me keep track of all that's happening. One day they will help me remember just how crazy and rewarding this experience has been. I looked them over before writing the speech and gathered some random observations and recurring themes I thought I would share with you before wrapping this up and taking your questions. People ask me all the time, what's the biggest surprise about the job? There are actually several. But for starters, now that I am on the inside, I realize the Washington press corps, as determined and diligent as they are to ferret out the truth, quite often just scratch the surface of what is really going on. Most of the issues we deal with are way more complex and nuanced than they are portrayed in print, even by the Pentagon press corps, which is the most responsible in town. However, and this may seem a bit at odds with what I have just told you, it is equally surprising to me how much sensitive, indeed classified, even top secret, compartmentalized information is leaked to the press. Information that potentially puts lives at risk and jeopardizes our nation's security. It is astonishing to me that in order to advance a personal agenda or for the thrill of seeing themselves in print, anyone would leak such information to the press. I believe it is actually treasonous in some cases, but it happens way more often than you would care to know. The best part of my job is the time I spend with the troops in the field. It is such a privilege to watch them in action. I know it is in vogue to rave about our men and women in uniform these days, but not until I visited our forces in Iraq and Afghanistan did I really get it. These young troops, many still in their teens, are doing really incredible things. Not just kicking in doors and capturing and killing terrorists. In many ways, that's the easy part. Harder, much harder, is building up the capacity of local governments so that they can be responsive to the needs of their citizens. That requires our troops to modernize infrastructure, improve healthcare facilities, create jobs, and reform judicial systems, just to name a few of their responsibilities. But all that is now part of the day's work for our soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines. Whenever I am with them, I wonder to myself how they will ever go back to or return to their conventional jobs. Sure, they'll be safer and closer to their family and friends, but how boring after all the responsibility they now have, after seeing their blood, sweat, and tears literally transform a society. When I was on the outside looking in, it was obvious that the world is an increasingly dangerous place. But I always had faith that there were wise men on the inside who would keep us on course. Well, now that I work with the wise men, I realize there are far fewer of them. I realize, first of all, that the world is way more dangerous than I had feared, and that there are far fewer of those wise men than I had once thought. It makes me appreciate Bob Gates all the more. He is the consummate grown-up, and I believe has been invaluable in helping the President navigate some really treacherous waters right now. I believe the nation owes him a debt of gratitude for his decades of selfless service. He recently told me that one of the biggest changes in government he has noticed since returning from his 14-year hiatus is how many more crises the President and his staff must juggle at once. When Dr. Gates worked at the National Security Council in the early 1970s, they were at one brief point dealing with 3 major crises and thought that was an incredible challenge. Now, in addition to fighting 2 wars at once, the President and his national security team must also contend with the nuclear ambitions of Iran and North Korea, the terrorist safe haven in Pakistan, which is already a nuclear power, an increasingly belligerent Russia, as well as confusing signals from China, a vital economic partner on one hand, but which also has a military that is expanding rapidly and without explanation. Lesser known is the burgeoning terrorist activity in the Horn of Africa and Southeast Asia. There is, to say the least, a lot on the Secretary's plate. But as he juggles it all, he manages to maintain his sense of humor and strongly encourages us to do the same. It may be hard to believe, based on how serious he normally looks, but he loves a well-timed joke in the middle of a tense meeting, and he tells hysterically funny stories from his years in government, especially tales of famous colleagues such as Bush 41's National Security Advisor Brent Scowcroft, routinely falling asleep, even snoring in Oval Office meetings, only to wake up and without missing a beat rebut a point that had been made while he was zonked out. Luckily, I have yet to doze off in front of the president, but then again, I've only met with him once since taking this job. That happens to be as many times as I've met with Russian Prime Minister Vladimir Putin, Chinese President Hu Jintao, and Afghan President Hamid Karzai. You see, the Secretary includes me in all those meetings with foreign leaders, not just so that I know what's going on and so that I can relay it, at least what's appropriate to reporters, but because he believes it sends a signal to governments that do not necessarily share our same respect for the press, and that we value the contributions of the Fourth Estate so much that we give their liaison a seat at this table. During one such meeting in Singapore, a discussion with the French defense minister, we were having a little trouble understanding each other. The translator, a striking buxom blonde wearing jeans and a torn t-shirt and clutching a gigantic French-English dictionary, was struggling to keep up with the conversation. So when the Secretary asked if the French would be sending any of their special forces to Afghanistan, the interpreter must have botched the translation, because the minister, looking a bit offended by the Secretary would ask such a thing, replied, "But of course, all French forces are special." When the meeting was over and the French delegation was long gone, the Secretary, furious by how unprofessional the translator was, mandated that from that point on we would travel with our own translators, no matter what the cost. While he was laying down the new ground rules, I had wandered over to the French side of the table and noticed some notes on a piece of paper. I started laughing out loud, and the Secretary, still fuming, asked what was so funny. It turns out one member of the French delegation had written a note to the other expressing disbelief that the translator was carrying a dictionary the size of the Bible. Perpetuating the classic French stereotype, the other one wrote, "Why, yes, but she's cute." So as angry as the Secretary had been, he cracked up and laughed along with the rest of us. Which brings me to my final point. The Secretary is by nature very understated, but at my urging, he reluctantly agreed to cooperate with a big New York Times Magazine profile on him. At the end of a rather long interview, the reporter was pressing him about whether he would consider staying on in the next administration. Extremely popular on both sides of the aisle, Dr. Gates routinely gets that question, and he gave his usual answer. He learned long ago never to say never, but he could not conceive of such a circumstance. Then he talked at length about his distaste for Washington, D.C., and his yearning to return home to the Pacific Northwest. At that point, he reached down into his briefcase and yanked out a small clock, a countdown clock, which was counting down the days to January 20th, 2009, of course, Inauguration Day. Well, it was earlier in our relationship, but I was a little nervous about this line of attack by the Secretary, so I dared to interrupt and suggested to him that he did not mean to leave the impression that he is not enjoying the job. He turned from the interviewer, looked at me rather sternly, and said something to the effect of, "Geoff, what's to enjoy? What's to enjoy about losing 932 troops on your watch?" I can't remember the exact number, but he knew it precisely. He knew precisely how many men and women had been killed since he took over the department. He never forgets that real people in harm's way are impacted by every decision he makes, and he makes sure that we remember that too. We work extraordinarily long hours under intense pressure, but if you were to ask any one of us, especially the Secretary, we would tell you it is an incredible honor to work at the Pentagon in support of all those men and women on the front lines who 7 years to the day after America was attacked are fighting to try to prevent it from ever happening again. Thank you.
We have time for some questions. If you raise your hand, we'll get a microphone to you. Start in the front row.
Can I just say one thing before you begin? That was a very personal sort of retrospective of my career. I hope that was what you're looking for. I'm more than happy to talk about policy matters, controversial policy matters. So have at it. I'm here. You want to talk about the war? You want to talk about internal policy issues? You want to talk about some of the strategic communication challenges we have? I'm happy to do it.
Welcome. I noticed about the time we entered Iraq is about the time Putin geared up the missile program in Russia again. And he's been sort of on a path of bringing Russia back up militarily and also in the expression of that country. The missiles in Poland, they have a great deal of problem accepting that. And I think back to my youth in a place called Cuba, and somebody who was president named Kennedy. Would you talk about that in relationship to stability and really whether that is a good idea to be pushing Russia that hard whenever we almost went to war over a few missiles in Cuba?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. Truth is, we've tried to work with the Russians to do this missile defense shield with them. We were very transparent with them from the earliest stages about what the purpose of these 10 interceptors was. And they, of course, are of zero utility against the enormous strategic arsenal that the Russians still have. So the fact that they view them as a threat is really comical. The purpose of those interceptors, combined with the radar that we will put in the Czech Republic, is to try to protect our allies in Europe, as well as ourselves, from rogue nations developing long-range ballistic missiles. So now that we have a deal with both the Czech Republic and Poland, we will proceed with this. But you are absolutely right that there are many people who believe, including I think you heard a lot yesterday, in fact, on the Hill, particularly from Democrats, that they believe that this is not worth the poke in the eye to the Russians, that we have made it. My attitude is the Russians shouldn't view it as a poke in the eye. It's not a threat to them. We've tried to work with them on it. We offered at one point, in an attempt to get them to come on board, to have the facility be open to Russian inspectors, that they would have a permanent presence. They would have visibility both technically and physically into those facilities, and know exactly when where the interceptors were aimed and so forth, so they could tell for themselves that it wasn't a threat. What's more, we offered not to make the system operational until we saw a test from Iran of a missile of a range, whose range was capable of hitting Europe. So I think we bent over backwards to try to make it clear to them this is not a threat, but you're right, they viewed it as at least provocative, but they also don't like the encroachment of NATO on their border. But I think they clearly can't view this as a real threat. I mean, this is an attempt to re-exert their influence over the near abroad. I mean, the Russian view of this is that they were humiliated after the fall of the Soviet Union. They didn't like how they were treated after that, and now, thanks to petrodollars, they have re-energized their economy. The country is now thriving economically, and they are attempting under Putin's leadership to re-exert themselves as a world power. With regards to their military, they are modernizing their strategic arsenal. That is the most economic way they have of building up their defenses. They will never be the military, the army they once were, because of demographic challenges. The Russian military is probably as large as it's ever going to be right now, because Russians simply are not reproducing at the rate required. Plus, it's a conscription army, And they've had historically great deals of hazing problems within the military, and morale is low. But they are increasingly wealthy, and they have the money to spend on modernizing their arsenal. I don't know if I answered you. I probably talked too much about all that, but...
Deeksha, do you have one back there?
Hi, Jennifer Hicks, class of 2010 here at the Clinton School. As both a former member of the Fourth Estate, and as a citizen, I was hoping that you could comment on the administration's decision to disallow journalists photographing the coffins of fallen soldiers coming back into the States.
Yeah, it's a good question. And as one, I wasn't there when that decision was made, nor was Secretary Gates, and I've never really had a conversation with him about what he thinks of it. Probably my instincts would be, if we were to revisit it, to allow such photography. There are, of course, a lot of considerations as to why not. I think chief among them is not what people might think, which is that we're sort of giving a tool that our enemies can use to exploit against us, or that it would somehow undermine the popular support in this country for the war effort. It's mostly, I think, out of consideration to the families. And all of our returning fallen come through Dover Air Force Base in Delaware, and obviously all of these families are strewn across the country. And I think the feeling is that if you had an event at Dover that was open to the press, that the families would somehow feel as though they should be there too to see their loved one come off that cargo plane. And that would be an enormous inconvenience to them at a time when they are just shell-shocked by the news they've just received. So as I have talked to a couple people who were around when the decision was made, I think a great deal of consideration was given to the needs of the family. But I think that at this point, my instincts would be that the more people see of what's actually going on, the more they'll understand it, and I think be able to support it. Not until I went, well, it baffles me, for example, last summer I went to Iraq for the first time, and I spent that week, as you saw. That same summer, we had, I think, dedicated 60 seats on planes, military planes, for congressional delegations to go see what was going on in Iraq for themselves. And keep in mind, this is at the point the surge probably hit its high water mark. All the forces flowed in June, which was also sort of the peak violence, and then we started to see a drop. So come their August recess, we had 60 seats available to them. I think fewer than a third of those seats were occupied by members of Congress. And sometimes you wonder to yourself whether people just don't want to see for themselves what's going on, because it could undermine their own predetermined positions and arguments. But I really believe that if you go and you see for yourself, and obviously the American people don't have that ability to do en masse, but through your journalists and through your reporters and news organizations, that's how you learn what's going on. So I am all for as much access as can be provided. I think the whole embedding process during the war was brilliant. I think everybody could agree that seeing the ground eye view of combat makes you appreciate how awful it is and the incredible bravery of those who are fighting it. And so I'm one of those who would rather err on the side of access than not. But I appreciate how the people, when they made this decision at the outset of the war, were very mindful of how families might feel about it. Does that work for you?
Tell.
You want to rebut me? Okay, that's the beauty of the system, isn't it?
Right there. Del, do Faisal. Faisal.
Hi.
Hi.
I'm a student at Clinton School, and my question, I go direct to my question. It's very simple. Did you ever have to communicate some policy that you think, and also you might feel it's just not right. And if you ever, maybe you would say you never have this dilemma, but if you have ever had this kind of dilemma, did you, how can you express that to the people that you are working for? Thank you.
Yeah, it's a very good question. I'm sure I have, but I can't remember an instance right now. But, you know, it's not about me. As I said, this is not my personality, my opinions, my style doesn't matter. I work for the Secretary, I work for the Department, I work for the men and women in uniform, I work first and foremost for the Commander-in-Chief, and I am there to relay what's going on truthfully to the American people. I'm not there to spin it. I'm there to tell them what's going on. Obviously, we can have differences of opinion about what the truth means and what the impact of it is. And obviously, I want to be an advocate as best I can for the policies that we are pursuing. But I can't remember an instance where I was really upset about something that I was required to talk about. But if there were such an instance, I think I would just, as I said earlier, grin and bear it, unless it were so morally offensive to me that it's something that was worth resigning over. But I certainly haven't come to any point like that, or even close.
Right here.
How do we find out through the press what good things are going on in Iraq, such as hospitals, grocery stores, universities, etc.? It's almost as though those are non-existent. I know it's not true.
Yeah, well, you know, listen, there was a big effort, you know, when probably the war was at its nadir, there was a big effort to sort of find the good news stories, and that was the effort of the administration before I joined there. There is a lot of good news going on, and I can walk you through some of it. But the truth is, the reporting resources in country are a shadow of their former selves. I think CBS, for example, has no Baghdad correspondent anymore. ABC is now down to, I think, a skeleton staff. I think NBC, their correspondent goes in and out of country. ABC may be the only network that still, of the broadcast networks, that still has a full-time correspondent there. If that, they may not have one now. But the point of the matter is, I don't know. I mean, I don't want to say this is the case, but it may be a coincidence. But as things started to improve, the commitment by the news media dropped. Now, that happened to also coincide with the beginning of the presidential campaign back here, which has just devoured their dollars. They're spending enormous sums of money on that. In fact, we travel a great deal, as I mentioned, with the Secretary, and we bring a pretty large press contingent with us. And we've been very lucky that we still have 12, 13, 14 people who sign up to come with the Secretary because there are other members of the Cabinet, when they traveled, that do not have that kind of following because of tight budgets. So I want to believe that what happened was there was another bigger story which required their focus, attention, and dollars. But it did happen to coincide when things started to improve, and there was less of the daily bombing and hysteria that provided for easy television coverage. Yeah, I don't want to go that far, but clearly there has been enormous progress in the country. And one of the things that sort of drives you crazy a little bit is this notion you hear constantly about, oh, well, there's been security gains, but there's been no political gains. The Iraqi parliament has been far more productive this year than the United States Congress has been. They have passed virtually all their benchmark legislation. The only thing that remains to be done is really the hydrocarbon law, and hopefully that will be something that will be taken up after the new year. But we're going to have provincial elections almost certainly this year in Iraq, and that will be another real watershed date because the Sunnis, as you know, boycotted the last elections, and now you have some areas of Iraq where you have a Sunni majority which is represented by the Shia minority, and they have been bristling under that governance for some time, and this is a chance to sort of balance the representation, and I think dramatically improve things among rival sects as a result of doing that. And this other nonsensical statement that gets repeated often, that the surge had nothing to do with the success we're seeing in Iraq. To me, it's self-evident that it did. People like to try to go back and do the chronology and say, well, the Anbar awakening was happening before the surge. It was on a very, very small scale. But when Sheikh Sattar, who was assassinated just after Labor Day last year, I guess about this time actually, stood up and said, you know what, I've had like 5 or 6 members of my own family killed. And most of these sheikhs, by the way, had retreated to Amman, Jordan, and they're all very wealthy, even though they live in what appears to be a somewhat primitive style, and had retreated to Amman and were hiding out there. But Sheikh Sattar had the guts to come back and stand up and say, I'm not going to take it anymore. And he came to the Marines in Anbar and said, I'm ready to work with you. Will you do it? And luckily there were enlightened commanders there who said yes, and parked an M1 tank in front of his house. So that was that M1 tank had a lot to do with him having the ability to start the awakening. I had the pleasure of dining with him before he was assassinated, but the influx of additional troops in Anbar clearly gave the confidence to more Sunnis in that region to stand up and fight back. And then people will say, well, Sadr instituted his truce. Well, Sadr also saw that his guys, sort of the radical element, the special groups, these Iranian-backed fighters, were being targeted by our special operators. And this was going to be a very dangerous venture if they were to continue as they were continuing. So, and then Bob Woodward has talked about how the special operations were really the key to the victory. And no doubt the special operators are incredibly heroic guys who are doing amazing things that unfortunately we can't tell you all about. But you needed more forces on the ground to create a climate in which more people felt secure and now willing to work with the Americans, that there wasn't that we weren't going to work with you one day and take off the next. The problem was, when we had 30,000 fewer troops there, we had a different strategy. We hung out in forward operating bases behind huge blast walls and rolled out on patrols in heavy armored vehicles, and then came back to our FOBs at night and didn't interact with the population otherwise. General Petraeus' strategy with these additional forces is, no, we're going to push out into the community. We're not going to all hang out behind big blast walls. We're going to team up with the Iraqi military and form these joint security stations in neighborhoods, 50 Americans, 50 Iraqis, and we're going to be there 24/7 to make sure they feel more secure. And by doing so, more Iraqis have felt, okay, I can work with these guys. And then the last thing was, we started this concerned local citizens or Sons of Iraq deal. You got this massive unemployment. You know, idle people, well, the terrorists would pay them. You need money and you got to support your families. These guys will pay you to go plant a roadside bomb. Well, we hired them to work for us, to secure their communities, to put on really street, remember the old school crossing guard ribbon? They have that, their regular clothes and a machine gun, and they protect their neighborhoods. And that combination of factors is what I believe did it, but it could not have been done without the additional forces, in my estimation.
We have time for one more question.
What about Andy Pearson? Does he have a question? I'll talk for as long as you want.
Actually, a serious question. I haven't caught much television today, but I was surprised that nobody asked, you didn't mention, where's Osama bin Laden? Are we ever going to catch him? What percentage of our forces are looking for him today?
This is Skip's question. We'd all like to know that, and you have to believe that we're doing everything we can to get him. But let me remind you that on September 12th, 2001, there probably wasn't one person among us who said or dared to dream that 7 years later we would have never been hit again. We would not have been hit again. The fact is that our aggressive operations after that have kept this country safe by taking it to those guys over there. We are focused very much on bin Laden, but you haven't seen him for quite some time. He's likely holed up in a cave. He likely has no operational control over Al-Qaeda. Yes, Al-Qaeda has sort of been franchised, if you will, around the country, but they do not appear to be under any direct operational guidance from bin Laden. However, clearly he's still, or the legend of him still inspires their radical behavior. But I can tell you this, Andy, we have not gotten him, but we've gotten a lot of guys under him. And the more guys we get under him, the more likely it is that we're going to ultimately get him.
Jeff's going to be here for a while, so you guys can, those with questions can come up and say, or individually talk to him. But let's give Geoff Morrell a big round of applause.
Thank you. Thanks, Jeff. Appreciate it.